Waterloo. It's a famously difficult station to escape from, so if you find yourself caught in the gravitational pull of what is, I believe, the UK's third busiest station, you're probably going to want to find a decent pub. Pub number 1, the Crown and Cushion. Cheers from the Crown and Cushion. This is a half of Bermondsey Best Bitter. I think that came in at £2.60. This was formerly a Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Co. brewery house, and it was designed, the current building, in the 1930s by architect Arthur Edward Sewell. What I particularly like about the exterior are these 2 plaster mouldings over each of the entrances. Each of those depict both a crown and a cushion, per the name of the pub, and also an eagle, which is the logo, the motif for the Truman's Brewery. To me, this smacks of Neo-Georgian architecturally, and that is classic Arthur Edward Sewell. It has a hip roof, there are shutters on the upper floors, and some of that ground floor frontage is tiled with cream tiles. Also above those 2 plaster mouldings of the crown and the cushion, you can see some, obviously much later, Guinness signs, and they're of some age in their own right. The interior is mostly wood panelled, and it's more or less an Irish pub, so it has the usual Guinness marketing material that you'd expect to find, things like signposts to places in Ireland, as well as other knickknacks like brass plates and tankards up on a high shelf. There were also a couple of TVs on showing the snooker during my visit, but they weren't particularly loud, so it wasn't too intrusive, and some fruit machines in one corner. Generally though, nice and quiet, and it is a bit of a geezer's pub. I love these places, but they are a bit more difficult to film the interior footage in without disturbing the regulars. It also had a nice courtyard garden out the back, more knickknacks and things on the wall there, including quite an impressive display of Irish car license plates, and I think a few of these over to the right hand side are also American. I suspect that the pub probably goes back to the latter half of the 18th century. I don't think it was yet built at the time of John Rock's map of 1746. It looks to me, based on the outlines of the buildings at that time, that there wasn't a building in this specific location. There are Sunfire Office insurance records back to 1781. Its address at that time was Mount Street, and it was at that time known as the New Crown and Cushion. So by the time of Horwood's map of 1799, it would have been present. So of course it would also have been present at the time of the Greenwood map of 1828. If we zoom out from that map a bit, it shows the extent at that time of the land attached to Lambeth Palace and the proximity of the pub to the back of that area of land. That to me gives a sense of where the name for this pub, the Crown and Cushion, may have come from. Crown and Cushion is of course a motif associated with coronation, and of course the Archbishop of Canterbury, who resides at Lambeth Palace, is responsible for crowning the monarch. So I suspect this is somehow a reference to that. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for the pub is from 1831, and at that time the pub was up for sale. It's interesting that it is noted as a free public house. Is that the forerunner of what we call today a free house, presumably therefore with no brewery ties? A later newspaper mention from 1832 retells the tragic story of a newlywed man dying in a horse and carriage accident. The London Metropolitan Archive has records that suggest that this was already a Truman's pub by the 1890s, and as we said earlier, it was likely rebuilt by them in the 1930s. Pub number 2, the Duke of Sussex. Cheers from the Duke of Sussex. Having a half of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. I included this on today's itinerary partly because I thought it made for an interesting run after the previous pub, the Crown and Cushion. This is another Truman's pub, and again was designed by Arthur Edward Sewell, this a little bit earlier in 1924. Happily, the exterior at least has been well preserved, and we can still see that original tiled fascia. I think I would once again describe this as Neo-Georgian. I don't think the interior is, alas, much to write home about. Heavily modernised today, very, very much gone down the gastropub route, alas, but you can still go to the bar and just get a pint, and there's a lot of outdoor space here, including it sort of partly backs onto or fronts onto a green that's next door, so there's plenty of space to spread out and enjoy the exterior without having to be blighted by the Farrow and Ball that no doubt bedecks the interior. The pub was named for Prince Augustus Frederick, the Duke of Sussex, And we have encountered him before recently in that video on Hammersmith's Pubs. He had that smoking house next door to the Dove. He lived from 1772 to 1843 and was granted the title of the Duke of Sussex. It had never been used prior to him. On his death it became extinct and wasn't actually revived until the more famous Duke of Sussex that you may know in 2018. The Duke of Sussex was the 9th child of George III and Queen Victoria's favourite uncle. It was he who gave her away at her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840, of course her own father having died 20 years prior to that. Despite his love of sitting by the Thames smoking his pipe, he was not simply a man of leisure. He used his place in the House of Lords to promote just causes like the abolition of slavery and religious freedoms for Jewish people, Catholics and the Protestant dissenters. He was a very popular figure. When he died in 1843, the Times newspaper commented at the time that no death in the royal family short of the actual demise of a monarch could have occasioned a stronger feeling of deprivation. So we know from that bit of history that the title Duke of Sussex did not exist prior to 1801. So that is the earliest date that this pub could have taken that name. In Walter Thornbury's Old and New London, there is a reference to a manuscript list of around 1810, which suggests that the pub was already here at that time. The earliest newspaper mention I could find of it is from 1822, and you can see Gibson Street, the name of the street this was on at that time, on Greenwood's map of 1828. There is a later newspaper mention of 1867 of the pub, of an inquest held here for a miser starving herself to death. Apparently she had £100 in savings despite having lived in absolute poverty day to day. The inflation calculator on the Bank of England website tells me that £100 in 1867 would be worth close to £10,000 today. Pub number 3, the King's Arms. Cheers for the King's Arms. I'm skulking around the back because it is justifiably busy in there. I think this is a cracking pub. This is the only pub on today's itinerary that makes it onto CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors, and it's also a listed building. I think it's probably 1820s given the known development dates for Rupel Street, which is the street that it finds itself on, and we'll say a bit more about Rupel Street later. Historic England describe it as being early to mid 19th century, which I think ties in well with that guess from me of 1820s. So you know me, I can't resist a fluted pilaster, and there is a nice array of those along the frontage here, as mentioned in the Historic England listing, and they have floral capitals. I think that means a sort of a riff on Corinthian. CAMRA's listing for the interior talks about the interwall fittings. It has a rare example of a surviving partition. We say rare, but we seem to see a lot of these. I mean, I do disproportionately go and seek out pubs that still have retained partitions, and the doors have possibly newer etched glass identifying one side as the public bar and the other side as the saloon bar. The glazing in those partitions looks to me quite interwar, or possibly slightly even later, that use of coloured glass in the screens there. There are also a couple of tiled fireplaces which again have that kind of 1930s feel to them. So I think the history of this pub is, like many pubs, very much linked with the history of the street that it is on. Rupel Street or Rupel Street, there seems to be some disagreement about how that should be pronounced. That was not yet developed at the time of Horwood's map of 1799. According to one source, Rupel Street or Rupel Street was laid out in around 1824. My guess is that the pub building at least probably dates to the 1820s, at least part of the reasoning there being that, of course, Queen Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837. It seems unlikely to me that a pub built after 1837 would be named the King's Arms, so I'm guessing this is an 1820s, 1830s pub, assuming it had that name from its origin. The street is named for John Rupel or John Rupel, who owned land in the area and commissioned the building of this and some of the neighbouring streets that are remarkably well preserved today. Little has changed since the 1820s, and it's now a conservation area. I think this may have briefly been called Navarino Street, recalling the Battle of Navarino. and you can see that on Greenwood's 1828 map, but that was probably a short-lived thing, and not long after that it was renamed to Rupel or Rupel Street. The earliest newspaper mention I can find that clearly identifies the pub at this location was from 1839, the landlord at that time having committed the heinous crime of adulteration of beer. It's in a very evocative part of London, given these very well preserved 1820s building. The Rupel Street or Rupel Street conservation area is a very popular filming location because it's so remarkably well preserved from the 1820s. So there's a whole list of filming credits here, from one of the terrible Daniel Craig era James Bond movies to Legend, that movie with Tom Hardy about the Cray twins, a couple of episodes of EastEnders I believe, and also Doctor Who. I think it's effectively an independent pub today. It's owned by a small pub co that own this and a few other neighbouring properties. It's called Windmill Taverns. It has a very good reputation for real ale. I'm having some market porter, which has just happened to grab me. At least 4 hand pumps on one side, and I think a possibly slightly different set of hand pumps on the other side of the bar. Pub number 4, the White Hart. Cheers from the White Hart. This is a half of Shropshire Gold from the Salopian Brewery. Slightly wish I'd googled this first because there is a little bit of Cascade hops. It's also got Brewer's Gold hops, which is a traditional, somewhat traditional 100-year-old English variety. This is just round the corner from King's Arms. We're still very much in that Rupel or Rupel Street conservation area. This is another pub, the third of today's pubs, that features on the Brewery History website. I think that's a really good site that has some interesting history. It doesn't tend to go into individual pub details that much, but it is pretty good for talking about brewery history at large. Of course, this has the fascia of the Wenlock Brewery. I'm guessing this dates to about the 1930s. It's roughly contemporary with those first 2 pubs we looked at today. The Brewery History site mentions that until 2019, at least some parts of that fascia were obscured. It's a corner pub. To me, again, it looks quite neo-Georgian, and I would say it's probably in the 1920s, sort of 1930s kind of range. The ground floor has darker tiles below the windows, and then these cream-coloured tiles from there upwards. There are 2 recessed tiled panels with the pub name, and they have similar dimensions to the windows. Inside, I mean, it has been somewhat modernised, and compared to the King's Arms, it does have a more sort of modern gastropubby sort of feel. But one of the things that I found quite attractive was towards the back there appeared to be a set of snob screens. I haven't seen this written about elsewhere. I mean, they could well be modern reproductions. Looking at the state of the wood, they didn't look particularly ancient, but certainly the style and the dimensions of them were quite consistent with clearly genuine examples that I've seen elsewhere. Prior to this area being developed, on Hallward's map of 1799 you can see a feature there identified as Halfpenny Hatch. This is where the father of the modern circus, Philip Astley, and his wife Patty staged their first show of horse riding in 1768. A year or 2 later they hired other entertainers, including acrobats and clowns, to fill the gaps between the equestrian bits, and that accidentally became the format for most modern circus shows. So this location is generally credited as being the birthplace of circus. At the time of Greenwood's map in 1828, apparently Cornwall Road was in the process of being developed. Probably the location of the pub is that row of buildings called Neptune Place, but I'm not sure whether the pub existed at that point in time. It was likely built, I think, in the 1840s, and a reasonably likely match for it that I could find in newspapers was from 1849. Quick note on the pub in its modern incarnation, it does have a bit of on-street seating, which is an interesting feature, although there are these little plaques which say these are only here in the daytime. These chairs are taken away at 4:30. Pub number 5, the Hole in the Wall. Cheers from the Hole in the Wall. Sorry about all the background noise. This is a challenging place to film. Probably some of you are thinking, has Tweedy gone mad? Why is he in a presumably very modern bar in the Railway Arches? How could that possibly be anything of any historical note? However, that was my first thought, but in fact I think there is a history of a pub of this name on roughly this site going all the way back to the 1860s. This arch that it is in forms part of the viaduct running alongside Metham Street, not sure how to pronounce that. And that is part of an extension to the South Eastern Railway that took it beyond London Bridge, which was its original London terminus, into Charing Cross over Hungerford Bridge. That extension was completed in 1864, and I think there is a good case to be made for the fact that this pub, or some version of it, has existed since then, with at least some part of the pub being in this railway arch that it occupies today. At least one source I read likened the interior to a 1970s Welsh rugby club. I think possibly some aspects of this interior may date to the 1940s. It has two bars, a front bar and a back bar. The front bar has a slightly smaller real ale selection than the back bar, which I think runs to a whole 7 hand pumps. The train noise here is all part of the character. You're just going to have to get used to it. Although, of course, the fact that this occupies an arch in a railway viaduct makes it very different from most traditional pubs. It does still have something like that traditional public bar and saloon bar divide. The front bar today, I suppose, would feel more like a saloon bar. It's a little bit more quiet. And the back, large, cavernous beer hall-like bar, something more like a public bar. I'm having a pint of the Brew York, is it, or Maris the Otter bitter, and I think that came in at a very reasonable, was it £4.95? The hole in the wall is of course quite a common name for pubs in England and possibly slightly further afield. As far as I can tell, this is currently the only example of a pub with that name here in London. There have been many theories as to where that name derives from, but the one that seems most credible to me is that it has some relation to these little wine windows you find in Italian cities. They're particularly prevalent in Florence, and they're called Bucchette del Vino, and this was something that came about during the era of the plague in the early 17th century. Of course, here it's a very literal interpretation of the name because this is a hole, an arch in a railway viaduct. The London Wiki, or Pubs History website, has records from the post office directory listings going back to the 1860s to 1869 for this pub. I think Gode's map of 1887 actually marks a PH for public house at roughly this point on the map. Much has changed in the local area, but since the 1860s, when this railway viaduct was built, that at least has been one constant feature. The street this is on now is called Metham Street, how you pronounce that, but back at that time there was a street that went through the railway arches here called Francis Street. Thanks again to the London Wiki, or Pubs History website, which suggested that this actually appears in the census records. In the 1891 census, an address at Francis Street where the main householder was one George Hulme. You can see as a footnote to the address it marks the hole in the wall, so it seems very likely that the pub existed in some form, possibly as a beer shop, as his occupation is given as beer retailer, as early as 1891. And indeed, if you go back in those census records in 1871, you can also see a George Hulme working as a wine and beer merchant on Francis Street. The numbering may have changed in the interim. So I think Francis Street and parallel Agnes Street were mostly demolished immediately post World War II, but you can see one tiny remnant of it on the other side of the bridge from here, which is a building called number 5 Witchcott Street. So Witchcott Street was the name that Agnes Street took post World War II. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for it, clearly stating the address here on Metham Street, however you pronounce that, was from 1974. But I think even in the 1970s this was considered to be quite a destination for real ale. There is a mention in that article that they were selling Breakspear's Bitter, one of the few places in London that were at the time. Okay, well that's it for today's tour of the pubs in the area around Waterloo Station. It has proved to be a difficult area to get away from, even if I wanted to. That joke may fall flat. I hope that's been of some interest. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.